For centuries, black has been associated with death and has become the traditional dress for a funeral, a sign of mourning. But have you ever wondered why? We believe we wear black out of respect for the deceased. That may be true today, but it was not always so. In ancient times, man so feared that the spirit of the dead could return, enter and possess the body, that they placed lighted torches around the deceased to ward off spirits. At one point in history, man painted their bodies black in an effort to hide from the spirits. As man became more civilized, mourners draped themselves in black fabric in an effort to hide from the spirits. The domain of the spirit world was darkness, and it was fear of that dark side that was the inspiration for many funeral traditions we are familiar with in our time. The earliest evidence of a ritual funeral has been traced to the Neanderthal of Western Asia some 50 to 60,000 years ago. Archaeologists discovered interred bodies strewn with pollen, all that remained of a variety of flowers that covered the body. The flowers included coneflower, hollyhocks, ragwort, grape hyacinth, and yarrow. Food, hunting weapons, and fire charcoal also accompanied the remains. Many cultures placed those things so the deceased would have them to use in the afterlife. Even that early in history, man associated fire with funerals, for there is also evidence of torches at the Neanderthal burial sites. The lighted torches would keep the spirits away and hiding in the darkness. The word funeral comes from the Latin word funus, meaning torch. The early Romans began the tradition of placing lighted candles around the deceased. The hearse has an interesting roundabout beginning. It was not originally a vehicle to transport the deceased to the burial place. It began as an ancient agricultural implement, what we call a rake. I hope that's the right picture, yes. In 51 BC, when the Romans, under Caesar, conquered Gaul and made it part of the Roman Empire, they introduced the herpex to Western Europe. It was a triangular tool with tines made of wood or iron and was used to rake the soil. The residents of the British Isles called it a harrow. In the 11th century, when the Normans conquered the British Isles, they realized that the harrow, when inverted, resembled their ceremonial candelabra. The pronunciation then became hearse. The ceremonial candelabra was placed on and around the casket, which was draped with a pall, a black covering, just an extra little precaution. Then it was carried to the burial site. Over time, the candelabra grew to such proportions that it could no longer be carried by the casket bearers and had to be placed on a cart. Thus, the hearse. A pallbearer was originally a ceremonial position. During the procession, they simply held the corners of the pall and did not do the heavy lifting. That was left for the casket bearer. They were expected to walk in unison on each side of the casket during the march to the burial site. Today, the pallbearers get the heavy work. The wake comes from the tradition of watching that the deceased might wake. They watched over the body in hopes that life might return. It originated with the ancient Celts, who believed the deceased moved on to the afterlife, a better world, a reason for celebration. A traditional Irish wake includes food, music, dancing, an occasional toast, or 2 or 3 or 4. The Catholic Church in Ireland who let the heckler in? Is that better? Okay. Thank you. Okay. We'll go back. The Catholic Church in Ireland has tried numerous times to put an end to the drinking at the wake. They have yet to succeed. In early Greece, terracotta vessels with food and drink were placed near the corpse. It became common practice to cremate the body and place the ashes in an urn, much like the urns you see at the top of many headstones in a cemetery. For nearly 2,000 years, from circa 2600 BC until 600 BC, the early Egyptians mummified their dead. The process could take as long as 70 days to complete, and as much as 1.5 miles of linen or papyrus was used in the wrapping. During that time, millions of mummies were created. Mausoleums are commonplace in an older cemetery. The first mausoleum was built about 350 BC for Mausolus, a king of the Persian Empire, ruler of the city of Caria in Halicarnassus, which is modern-day Turkey. His wife Artemisia, who was also his sister, was so grief-stricken by his death that she had a magnificent tomb built in his honor. She died 2 years after her husband and was also buried there. The mausoleum was decorated with statues of animals, and at the top was a magnificent marble carving of a horse-drawn chariot carrying Mausolus and Artemisia. Word of the grand tomb spread and it became famous. The mausoleum, dedicated to Mausolus, was destroyed by an earthquake in the 15th century. This is what remains. Much of the rubble was used in construction throughout the city. It is listed as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The ancient Sumerians buried their dead in baskets made of plaited twigs. Our word for coffin comes from the Greek kophinos, meaning basket. The woven basket evolved into the wooden coffin. The slowly driven funeral procession did not originate out of respect for the deceased. The funeral cortege moved at a snail's pace for the simple reason that the candles that once surrounded the coffin on the hearse would stay lighted during the march to the cemetery. The word cemetery comes from the Greek koimeterion, a place for sleeping. The Latin coimeterium referred to the Roman underground cemeteries known today as the catacombs. A cemetery differs from a graveyard. A graveyard is a smaller burial place located around a church. As the population increased and disease spread, a need for more burial places arose. It was deemed safer to bury those who died of the plague and other contagious diseases away from the city. So the cemeteries were located in the countryside. Once a body was buried, the family still feared the spirit, visited the burial site. It was not until more recently in man's history that it was believed safe to do so. At that point in time, families began to carve names and dates and messages on the headstones. In Victorian times, people would spend the whole day in the cemetery. It was a long trip from the city to the country for families to pay their respects. So many times they brought a picnic lunch and spent the day. The mourning traditions familiar to us today stem from those early times. But it was Queen Victoria who had the greatest influence on mourning traditions. After her beloved Alfred died in 1861, a widow at the age of 42, Victoria wore only black for the rest of her days. From that time on, there were strict written rules of etiquette regarding mourning. The first rule dictates the length of time a widow spends in mourning to be 2 years. The first period of deep mourning lasts 1 year and 1 day. During that time, a widow must dress in widow's weeds. Black clothing, free of decoration other than black jet. No gold or silver is to be worn. The skirt, sleeves, and body of the dress are to be trimmed in crepe. A hat with a veil covering the face is worn until it's deemed all right for her to go out in public, but usually after 9 months. Then the veil can be worn trailing down the back. The time period varies due to circumstances. After 9 months, it is acceptable for the veil to be worn trailing down the back. Widow's weeds were to be made of bambasine, Melrose, or Henrietta. But those are no longer readily available, so cotton, wool, or silk is acceptable. Furs are not to be worn the first year of deep mourning. Black stockings and shoes, along with black kid gloves, these are acceptable for that first year of mourning. If a widow does not own a black dress, she must see her dressmaker. If finances are prohibitive, a dress can be dyed black. Following the first year, a widow begins the period of half mourning. At this time, she can wear purple or gray. The crepe can be removed. Furs can be worn, but only dark furs. Mourning etiquette for a man is less restrictive. He should wear a black suit. If he sports a cane, a black ribbon is tied around the cane. A black armband is worn around the upper arm. Children who have lost a loved one do not wear entirely black. Their clothing is trimmed in black, and of course, they are seen, not heard. The period of mourning varies depending on the relationship of the deceased. Other than family members, a notice was sent inviting mourners to attend the funeral. After brushing, a woman's hair was saved in a hair saver. It would be washed, brushed, and then woven into jewelry. It was not until the late Victorian era that this became associated with mourning. At the time of the Civil War, a young lady would carry a lock of her loved one's hair in a locket, usually a gold locket. If he didn't return, the hair was placed in a black locket. Hair was also woven into shapes such as flowers and leaves and then made into wreaths, with a picture of the deceased in the center. But watch fobs were probably the most common item made of hair. There are a couple examples up here if you want to come and look later. Along with the fear of the dark side and the traditions of the Victorian era, superstition has played a role in man's behavior for centuries. Webster defines superstition as any belief or attitude based on fear or ignorance that is inconsistent with the known laws of science or considered in the particular society as true and rational. Do you cover your mouth when you yawn? Of course you do, but respect for your neighbors. Superstition says you must cover your mouth when you yawn, so evil cannot enter your body and your spirit does not leave you. Are you careful not to step on the cracks on the sidewalk? Don't step on a crack, you'll break your mother's back. Don't step on a line, you'll break your mother's spine. Do you watch out for black cats? Don't let a black cat cross your path. Oh, there he is. How many times have you knocked on wood? You should throw spilled salt over your left shoulder. Or is it your right shoulder? Which is it? Somebody knows. Somebody knows. So are you superstitious, or are these just all things that stem from your childhood? I'll bet you don't open an umbrella in the house. I'm going to tempt fate. Superstition is related to almost everything we do, but when it comes to death, the number of superstitions is endless. There are certain things a person must do to ward off bad luck or evil spirits. Superstition says, if you see an ambulance or a hearse, touch a button. The next. Oh. Clocks in the house must be stopped if the deceased is in the house, or you will have bad luck. You must hold your breath while passing a cemetery, so spirits cannot enter your body. In making coffins, the carpenter must be careful to gather all the shavings and sawdust and place them in the coffin. If any should be left in the house, death will follow. There are also things you must not do. Superstition says, do not smell flowers that grow on a grave, or you will lose your sense of smell. Do not count the conveyances in a funeral procession. Do not erect a tombstone in less than a year after death, else there will be another death in the family. Never put your shoes on the table, or you will die by hanging. A woman should not be buried in black, or she will come back to haunt the family. Nothing new should be worn to a funeral, especially new shoes. Birds and animals play an important role in superstition. A rooster crowing at midnight means death is nearby. Counting 6 crows will cause death. To see 3 seagulls together flying overhead is a warning sign of death. Seeing a white chicken on the way to a funeral brings bad luck. If a cow moos at midnight, it is an evil omen. But if a cow raises its head and smells the air, someone has died nearby. There are many warning signs of death that you can watch for. If cracks appear in bread while baking, if you miss a row of planting, the whining of a dog under a window, a picture falling from the wall, a horse neighing at a funeral, if a cricket gets into the house, if someone sneezes at the table. Then there are the superstitions that defy all logic. After eating boiled eggs, always smash the shells to prevent witches from sailing out to sea and drowning sailors. I don't make these up. If you say Mary Worth 100 times into a mirror in a darkened room and she appears, you will die soon. Of course, you know what a broken mirror means. 7 years bad luck. If you brush your hair more than 111 times, someone in the house will die. When a loved one dies, pour bourbon around the house to chase the evil spirits away. Seems like a waste of good bourbon to me. Most people believe in heaven, but how do you get there? Superstition says a person who dies on Good Friday will go straight to heaven. A person who dies at midnight on Christmas Eve will immediately enter through the gates of heaven because they're open at that time. Thunder following a funeral means that the deceased person's soul has entered heaven. The soul of a dying person cannot escape and enter heaven if the doors of the house are locked. If rain falls on a corpse, that person will go to heaven. So apparently, you don't have to worry much about being good. It's all a matter of timing. Many religious traditions originated in ancient times and are considered by some as superstitious. Burning incense, lighting candles, covering the casket with a pall, praying over the deceased, the laying of a crown on the head of the deceased to ensure that they will have a crown when they enter heaven. If you choose to wander through a cemetery one day, be sure to pay close attention to what's growing on the grave. Superstition says flowers will grow on the grave of a person who lived a good life. If the person was evil, only weeds will grow on the grave. Happy Halloween. Thank you. You're welcome to.